All right. I think we are live. There we go. All right. Hey, everyone. Welcome to the session. Thanks for coming in. It's a pleasure to be here again this week with you. And as with every week, I'll just say that I am honored to be with you in this time of sensitivity and uncertainty. And I look forward to sharing time with you in our shared sacred space today. I also want to say today, happy solstice. We are now in the period of the year where it is the longest darkness and the shortest light, which from my perspective is not a bad thing. The darkness is nourishing in its own way. And we are deep now in the womb of Earth and of time. And so in this time, I hope you're all sleeping well, safe and happy and healthy, and taking deep, restorative, regenerative rest in this very sacred season of time, especially this year with everything that's been going on all around us in the world. And so for our sacred space today, which is just lovely that it happens to fall so close to solstice, we're going to do our usual kind of things today in sacred space. The first is we will set our sacred space together. And the second is that we will talk about our topic for the week, launched by a fairy tale that Gary, my editor in Bangalore, who will be joining us in a moment, has selected. And the topic this week is what comes after grief. What comes after grief, which we didn't plan for solstice, but it just kind of happened that way. And so we'll tell the story, we'll have our talk, we'll do a little bit of an exercise, and then we'll close sacred space from there. So we'll go ahead and start, and I'll go ahead and set sacred space together. Let me just make sure all the feeds are working. All right. Looks like everything is working. Okay. So what we would like to do here together as a group is to create, for the period of an hour or two, a space that is devoid of fear, threat, and control, in order so that we can open to higher guidance from within our own selves. And by higher guidance, we mean however you take that to mean within your own self. To yourself, it could be your intuition, it could be communing with the divine, it could be getting downloads from your muse, however you think about that. Opening yourself to random flashes of insight and brilliance. A safe sanctuary space for us all to be able to relax and surrender with no feeling of danger or threat, so that we can partake of the emotional nourishment and spiritual nourishment that comes from being in sacred space together as a group. And in opening sacred space today, I'll propose, as I do every week, that we follow the 4 principles of Presidian sacred space. Number 1 is, well, typically it's confidentiality, standard Vegas rules. What happens in sacred space stays in sacred space. Here online, the stream is public, the replay will be public. So instead of in order to do confidentiality, we will do that via anonymization. So if you would like to be anonymous as you chat, as you ask questions, you don't have to be, nor do you have to chat or ask questions. But if in participating in any way you would like to be anonymous, you would come into the Crowdcast stream, go into your edit profile, and then edit your profile and just change your username to Harry Potter, Mickey Mouse, what have you. And then you'll be anonymous. So that's the first principle, confidentiality, and in our case, by anonymization. Number 2, we would like to maintain an atmosphere of no threat, no controlling, and not just malicious, hostile threat or controlling, but also well-meaning threat and controlling. So no fixing, no interventions, no tough love. where we say, well, you better do this, or else no healing for you, no spiritual development for you, no pain relief for you. Even that, however well-meaning, is a form of threat. There's nothing wrong with that. But because it is of the nature of threat and control, it is of the nature of profane. And there's nothing wrong with profane. But that's typically 99% of our lives. And the whole point of being here is to create a sacred space for some period of time in the week where it is intrinsically devoid of fear, threat, and control. So even well-meaning fear, threat, and control for your own good. This will hurt you more than it hurts me. Nothing wrong with that, but we're just not going to do that for the next hour or two. And then afterwards, kind of all is fair again. So here we are holding space for each other to be however we actually are. All right, to be afraid, to be anxious, to be happy and relaxed, right? Or to be afraid and anxious and be okay with that you're afraid or anxious, or to feel guilty that you're afraid or anxious, or to be happy and relaxed and feel really guilty about being happy and relaxed, or to be okay with that. However you are, we just leave you as you are, but we don't take our attention away. And we're just okay with that. We accept each other as we are in this space. No fear, no controlling, no fixing, no tough love. The third principle, which is a corollary, is one of no commerce. So because we're in sacred space, nothing may be sold or recommended or even suggested. So this goes hand in glove with the no controlling, no threat. I can't sell you anything. Gary can't sell you anything. So if I sell you something, I'm basically saying, take this hair tonic, right? Or else you will not get a beautiful head of hair. And that's an implied threat, even though it may be seemingly for your own good. Also recommendations, even if there's nothing being sold, it's like, oh, there's a great book you should read that'll fix that problem right up. And the implied threat, however well-meaning, is that if you don't check out this book, you'll lose out. Right? So no commerce, no recommendations. We are here for your energy, not for the things you bring. We are here for the essence of what you actually are, not for what you do or provide. For you, not for your value add, not for your functionality, just for you. And the fourth principle is that there is no expectation of participation. So there's no pressure to do anything, to chat or not chat, to ask questions, not ask questions. You can come and go as you please. There's no need to say, sorry, I need to go early. Just come and go as you please. We're here for you and each other. And again, the nourishment comes from the held space and your presence and attention from what you are, not from what you do or provide. And here in a group, all of us together will tend to amplify that effect so that we all can sort of take nourishment in this kind of potluck, right? of emotional and spiritual nourishment. So this is what I propose. And if you are not okay with what I've just described, that's totally okay. We will give you a moment now to make your selection, and if you'd like, withdraw from the group. And that's totally fine. We'll still hang out with you later in profane space. We'll still hang out. In other words, there's no fear, threat, or control for you to even come to sacred space or even stay in sacred space. It's totally however you want to do it. So we'll give you a moment now just to make your selection. Okay. And for the rest of us now, we will now move forward together into sacred space. And as we enter into sacred space together, I'll just remind us that we are now in the hold of the four principles of sacred space: confidentiality / anonymization, no fear, threat, or control, no commerce, no recommendations, and no expectation of participation. All right. Welcome back to Sacred Space, everyone. Happy Sunday. Happy solstice. All right. So let's move to our topic of the week. And the topic of the week here, sorry, let me just pull this up here, is what comes after grief. what comes after grief. And this week, when Gary pulled the story, it really brought us into a brainstorm, a deep dive into what the healing journey looks like after a phase of grief. Now, after you come out of a phase of grief, I mean, this is obvious, but just to say it, it's not the last phase of grief. Life is cyclical, right? I mean, winter comes around every year. But the idea is that, every fairy tale kind of tends to zoom in on a specific sort of segment or fragment of the overall circumambulation and healing journey of life. And in this story, it really brought us to this brainstorm about what happens after grief. So after we have taken the courageous step of willingly going down to sit with pain and loss, without running away, without numbing, without distracting from the loss. In other words, when we grieve, what happens after we begin to emerge from this state of being? And the story this week, I think, is from the Northern European tradition. So I'll invite Gary up on screen for her to tell us about the story. And we'll have her tell the story and then let the golden thread kind of guide us from there. Hey, Gary, how are you?
Hey, how are you? Hi, hello, everyone. Okay.
All right.
So,
welcome.
yeah.
Do you want to tell us about the story?
Yeah, so this is a story from the Norwegian tradition. And I'm really excited about it because it's kind of very different from the stories we've done so far. I mean, every story is kind of different in its own way, but I've always kind of stayed away from longish stories, which kind of go on for a while because, to keep short. But this one, I absolutely, fell in love with the rhythmic nature of the story. So I felt like even if it felt repetitive and a bit long, I would still love to do this. So, yeah.
I love it. So before you start, just the one thing I was thinking of kind of equipping everyone with before we go into the story is that it will seem familiar. We typically follow the sort of feminine version of the story in our popular media. And the other thing is, in dreams and myth and fairy tale, the number 3, when you see it and encounter it, is typically a symbol of completion of a cycle, right? Solstice, right? Completion of a cycle. Things happen in 3s, not in 4s, not in 6s, right? So it's 1, 2, 3. We don't say 1, 2, 3, 4. We say 1, 2, 3. There's a reason for that archetypally. We say ABC, 1, 2, 3. We don't say ABCD, 1, 2, 3, 4. So 3 is a completion of a cycle. We say beginning, middle, end. We think of life cycles in 3s also. Caterpillar, cocoon, butterfly. Now, there are many different sub-stages within that, but we basically group complete cycles into groups of 3. And so when you hear the story, these stories were all given in oral tradition, which means they were spoken around the fire, right? And at feasts and banquets. And so as Gary tells the story, you'll see the recurrence of the number 3. It'll be 3 brothers and 3 horses and 3 phases and 3 harvests. And especially now in solstice, as I have said, we are kind of in this time of year on this very day, actually, in the next 24 hours, in the deepest dark of the solar cycle. The darkness of which is, not bad, but it's nourishing in its own way. Grief is one of the most deeply nourishing life forces there is. I've asked Gary to not sort of super abridge the story, but basically talk through the story so that you can actually feel, even in time and in your body, that rhythmic nature of 3. And if you start zoning out, that's okay. That's part of the effect. So with that, Gary, I'll hand it over to you.
Okay, thanks, Artie.
Thank you.
So the story is called Princess on a Glass Hill. But the way it begins is that once upon a time there was a man likely a farmer, who had a meadow, and he would regularly harvest a crop of hay from the meadow. And the meadow was kind of high up on the hillside, and there was a barn right next to the meadow to keep the hay. And in the last year or two, there was something strange that was happening. Every St. John's Eve, when the grass was at its greenest and thickest, the meadow was eaten down to the ground. Like there was not a blade to be found in the morning. Just overnight, right? As if there was like a whole herd of sheep had been there in the meadow feeding on it through the night. And in the morning, there was nothing. So this happened once and it happened twice. And then the man grew tired of losing his crop every year. So this time he called out to his sons. He had 3 sons, and the youngest son was nicknamed Boots. So he told his sons that one of you must go and sleep in the barn on St. John's Eve this time, and watch out for any kind of mischief, because I don't want my crop to be eaten this time. It's gone on for too long to be a joke anymore. So the eldest son was ready to go, and he went in the evening. He went to the barn. He lay down to sleep. He got ready. But as soon as it was dark, there was a loud clatter. And there was such an earthquake that the walls and roof of the barn started shaking and creaking and groaning. And the boy got scared, and he just started running as fast as his feet could take him. And he ran home and never turned back to look at what was going on. And in the morning, all the hay was eaten up. So the next St. John's Eve, the father said to his sons, I'm not going to lose my crop again. Want one of you to go and sit watch over in the barn and see what happens. And at this time, the second son was ready to try his luck. And he went off. He went to the barn in the evening, made his bed. He decided to kind of sit up and wait. But as the darkness came on, there was a rumbling and a quaking and a shaking of the earth, and the barn roof and the walls started shaking. And it was worse than even the previous St. John's Eve. And the second son got frightened, and he just took to his heels. And he ran back to the house and never turned back again. Now the next year, this time it was the turn of the youngest son, Boots. And when he got ready to go, the other 2 brothers began to laugh at him, and they made fun of him because they knew what had happened to them. So they looked at him and said, oh, you're just the man to watch the crop, because, all you've done in your life is just sit in the ashes and toast yourself by the fire. But, Boots didn't care for what they said, and he went away. And after he went into the barn and lay down, in about an hour's time, it grew dark, and the barn began to groan and creak, and there were dreadful sounds. And Boots said to himself, if it doesn't get any worse than this, I think I can stand it well enough. So a little while after that, there was another loud creak, and there was an earthquake, and everything in the barn started to fly all around. And Boots still said to himself, if it doesn't get any worse than this, I must say I probably can stand it out. And then came a third rumbling and a third earthquake. And the boy felt as though the walls and the roof of the barn were just going to come down on his head. He just stood still and waited. And it passed off. and everything was just quiet and still. But he was still anticipating some more action to happen. He thought, oh, maybe, it'll come again. But nothing happened. Everything was still. And after a while, he heard a noise outside the barn door, as if a horse was, chomping in the grass. So he went up to the door, peeped through, there was a gap in the door that he looked through, and he saw a horse feeding away. And that horse was big and fat and grand, something that Boots had never seen before. And on the grass next to it was a saddle and a bridle and a full set of armor for a knight. And all of this was made of brass. And it was so bright that in the darkness, light was gleaming from it. And the boy thought, oh, so it's you that eats up our hay. I'll soon put an end to that. And he took out his tinderbox, took the steel out of it, and he threw it over the horse. And the moment he did that, the horse just stood still in the spot, and it became so tame that the boy could do whatever he liked with it. So he got onto its back, and he rode it off to a place which no one knew, and he hid the horse there. So the next morning he got back home, and his brothers laughed at him and asked him how it went. And Boots said, well, all I can say is I was in the barn till morning, and I saw nothing, I heard nothing, and I can't think of any reason why you both were so afraid. And the brothers didn't believe him. So they said, oh, you're going to tell us that you watched the meadow and everything's fine? And they set off to look for themselves, and they saw that the meadow was just untouched. The grass was just as deep and just as thick as they had left it before. So the next St. John's Eve, it was the same story again. Neither of the brothers dared to go out to watch the crop, so it was up to Boots. And he went back, and the same thing happened, but this time the clatter and the noise and the earthquake were louder and far worse than the year before. And after the 3 rounds of, quaking and shaking, everything was still. And he heard the sound of something cropping the grass outside the barn door. He went through, saw through the chink in the door, and he saw another horse. This time it was finer and fatter than the one before, and it had a saddle on it. It had a saddle and a bridle. It was wearing it already. It was made of silver. And next to the horse on the grass, there was a full suit of mail for a knight, and that was made of silver as well. And Boots said, okay, so it's you that gobbles up our hay. I'm going to put an end to that. And he took the steel out of his tinderbox, threw it over the horse's head, and the horse just stood still. And he got onto the horse, rode its back, and then went to the hiding place where he had kept the previous one. He hid the second horse there as well, and he went back home. The brothers, again, would not believe him, and they said, oh, you're going to tell us there's a fine crop this year as well? And they went up to see, and the meadow was intact. But that didn't stop them from mocking and jibing at Boots. It didn't make them go any easy on him. And now the third St. John's Eve had come, and they still didn't have the courage to go and watch. So Boots went up again. And this time, the same thing happened. There were 3 earthquakes, one after the other, each one worse than the one before. And when the last one had happened, the boy just stood still, and everything was quiet. And then he heard the sound of the grass being eaten. So he went in, looked through the door, and he saw a horse outside. It was much bigger and fatter than the 2 before. And he did the same thing. He pulled out the steel out of the tinderbox, threw it over the horse's neck, and the horse just stood still. He rode off with the horse, and this time the horse was saddled and bridled in gold, and the mail lying next to it was also made of gold. So he took the horse to the same place, hid it with the other two horses, went back home, and all was fine. Now, where Boots lived, the king of that country had made an announcement. He had a daughter, and he announced that he would only give his daughter to the man who could ride up over a hill of glass. There was basically a very high hill, completely smooth and slippery as ice, and the daughter would be sitting on top with 3 golden apples in her lap, and any man who could ride up all the way to the top and carry off the 3 golden apples was to have half the kingdom and the princess to marry. So the king had put up these notices on all church doors and his kingdom and all the other kingdoms. And this princess was so beautiful that anyone who saw her just fell in love with her. So there were princes and knights, and everyone who'd heard of her came to the kingdom to take part in the contest. And the day of the trial, there was such a crowd around the hill because everyone, all the princes and knights were there, and everyone in the country had come up to watch because they were all eager to see who this man would be. And the 2 elder brothers also wanted to go, so they set off with everyone. And Boots wanted to go with them as well. And they said outright, you can't go. Because they didn't want to be seen with such a dirty, grimy, dusty, sooty guy who sat in the dust hole all day. And they said, what would people think of us if they saw us with you? So Boots said, all right, it's all the same to me. I can go alone and I can stand or fall by myself. So after the 2 brothers left, the knights and the princes had all gathered around the hill, right, at the foot of the hill. And as it began, everyone tried going up. And every time they set foot on the hill, they kept slipping down. And they couldn't even go up a yard. And the princess was sitting right at the top, waiting and waiting. And all the horses, all the knights who gathered, they just grew tired. And no one could as much move an inch on it. Right. And the king thought, okay, I'm going to kind of announce that the trial will extend for another day, just to see if anyone else has better luck the next day. And just as he was thinking that, there came a knight on a horse with mail of brass, and the horse had, the saddle made of brass. And it all was so bright that the sunbeams were shining from it. And everyone else called out to this knight and said, watch out, no one has been able to, climb up, so it's of no use. But the knight just didn't, pay any heed to that. He just rode up. And he went all the way up with barely any effort. And the princess looked at him and just thought how wonderful it would be if he could just ride up all the way up and come down on the other side. But it so happened that this knight just only rode 1/3 of the hill up. And as soon as he had reached 1/3, kind of turned back and rode off the hill. But because the princess was so looking forward to seeing him ride all the way up, she threw a golden apple right at him, and it rolled down and fell into his shoe. But when this knight got to the bottom of the hill, he rode off so fast that no one could catch him or see who he was. So the king inevitably extended the trial for one more day to see if anyone else succeeds. And the brothers came back home and they had a long story to tell about the day's events. So they told Boots about the whole thing, and they also told him about this knight in brass mail. And Boots was excited. He said, I would have liked to see him. And immediately the brother said, oh, you would you? You think you're fit to keep company with such high lords? You nasty beast who you just sit there among the ashes? And the next day they set off again, and Boots this time begged them to go with them. And they said the same thing. You're too ugly, you're too nasty, we don't want to be seen with you. So Boots said, okay, if I go, I have to go by myself, and I'm okay. So the brothers went, and all the princes and knights were there. They were trying their luck again. And they had kind of taken care to shoe the horses new, and nothing helped. They all rode, they all slipped. Nobody could get up the hill. And the whole day passed. They had all worn out. And this time they were all hoping that they would see the knight in brass mail come back again and try his luck one more time. But nobody saw anything of him. But instead, this time there was another horse that came, far grander than the previous one. And this time it was all in silver, and there was a knight with silver mail, and he rode up, right, and the others were shouting to him that this is too difficult, no one succeeded, watch out. He paid no attention to any of that. He rode straight up the hill, right up until he had gone 2/3 of the way. And the princess looked at him. She liked him better than the knight in brass. And she sat there and wished that he might be able to come right up to the top and go down the other side. But as he approached 2/3 of the hill, she saw him turning back. And she threw the second apple after him, and rolled down and fell into his shoe. And as soon as he came down the hill of glass, he rode off, and no one saw anything of him after that. So there was still one golden apple left, and no one had still succeeded in reaching the top. So the king said that he would extend the trial for one more day to see if anything came out of it. And so the brothers went back home, and they told the story and the events of the day. And Boots listened to all of that, and he said, oh, I should so like to have seen the knight in silver mail. And again, the brothers laughed at him and said, you think his coat of mail, was as bright as the ashes that you keep poking about, but you can only hope, right? And then the third day came, and the same thing happened. They set out. Boots begged to go with them, and they wouldn't hear of it. When they went to the hill, everyone had started trying their luck, and this time it's pretty much everyone had given up. They thought that the knight in silver mail would come and probably do his best. But the knight in silver mail didn't turn up. But finally, at the end of the day, this time, there was an even finer horse that showed up, and a knight with a full suit of golden mail, and a horse in golden saddle and bridle. And it just took everyone's breath away. It was so grand that everyone forgot to call out to him to say how difficult it was and not to try his luck. They all just stood there and watched. And this knight just rode right to the top of the hill. And he went up like it was nothing, no effort. And the princess didn't even have time to wish that he might come up all the way. And as soon as he reached the top, he took the third golden apple from the princess's lap, turned his horse, and rode down again. And as soon as he got down, he rode off at full speed, and he just disappeared. So this time when the brothers got home, they had even fancier stories to tell. And they started telling about this amazing knight in golden armor. And Boots said, oh, I would have loved to see him. and they mocked him, and I said, his mail shone a good deal brighter than the coals that glow in the stove that you keep poking at. So next day, all the knights and the princes were to appear before the king and the princess. And it was time for anyone who had the golden apples to declare, come forward and say, I have the golden apples. But the funny thing was, no one showed up. No one had it. And this puzzled the king. And he said, well, someone must have it. We saw with our own eyes. And by now, we're pretty sure it was the same man on all 3 days who came and rode up and took the apples and went away. So someone should have it. So he commanded that everyone who was in the kingdom should come up to the palace, and he would question them to see if they had the apples. They all came one after the other. No one had the golden apples. And after a long time, it was the turn of the two brothers, and they were the last of all. And the king asked them, do you have the apples? And they said, no. And he then said, okay, so is there anyone else in the kingdom who hasn't turned up yet? And the brother said, oh, well, we have a brother, but then, he wasn't the one. He didn't carry off any golden apples. He was sitting in his dust hole all 3 days. And the king said, well, never mind that. Bring him in. I will talk to him. And, so Boots had to go to the palace. And when he met the king said, well, have you got the golden apples? And Boots said, yes, I have. Here's the first, here's the second, and here's the third. And he pulled out all 3 golden apples out of his pockets. And at the same time, he threw off his sooty rags. And he stood before them in his shining golden mail. The king said, yes, you deserve half of my kingdom, and you deserve my daughter, and you shall have both. And so they got ready for the wedding, and Boots married the princess, and there was great merrymaking, and there was great joy. So that's the story. Artie, are you there? Okay.
Yay. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Love that story. Thank you. So let me start with the usual question I ask. Having read through the story again, where do you enter that story?
Like I said, it was just so, there was such a rhythm to it. The first thing that, of course, I noticed was, the repetition of number 3, right? Everything happens in cycles of 3. Right from even the crops failing, happens 2 years until the man decides that he wants to go and watch. So,
the fact that there are 3 brothers, and it's only the 3rd season where he finally says we need to do something.
Yeah. And right from there, right till the end, everything happens in sets of 3. So that is one thing that fascinated me. Like, this story is really trying to say something about this particular message, that there's so much emphasis on it. So that was quite intriguing. And the other thing is that the whole repetition was just, like you said, so soothing. And I remember as kids, we loved stories with repetition because they would kind of put us to sleep. Right? What was coming, but we wanted to hear it anyway. But then it just helped us go to sleep that much quicker. So I just love the fact that if I'd heard someone tell it while I was reading it, I'm sure I would have just loved to go to bed and kind of listen to the whole thing repeat over and over.
It's kind of a solstice-y like story. Yeah.
So so those were the things that really intrigued me about it. So that's where I thought I really need to know what this number 3 magic is about.
I love that. Thank you. So yeah, I mean, to me, as we discussed in our brainstorm, right, this is just, it's like a big neon sign. This is a story for me about what happens after you have gone through grief, right? This is basically an inner masculine version of the Cinderella story. What we had said last week, actually, when we referenced Cinder, I didn't even know the story was coming. Cinder is ash, Ella is girl. So Cinderella is ash girl. Ash, of course, is a symbol of grief. Right? You sit in ashes, you cover yourself in ashes, you gnash your teeth, you tear your garments. I mean, in countless world traditions, civilizations, ash is a sort of standard symbol of grief. And going into grief, sitting in the ashes is sitting in grief. So here, this is not ash girl, but ash boy. The brothers repeat over and over again. All you do is sit in the ashes. All you do is tend the hearth and sit in ashes. You have ashes on your boots. It's disgusting. You're like a beast. This is basically a frogman, right? This is basically the frog. Cinder lad, right? Is this boots figure is basically Neverwash from several stories back, the one who has gone down into the ashes. In some cases, made a deal with the devil, right? The sort of dark kind of person or part of you, right? That is down there, whose job it is to keep the flame going. And I think you found an alternative version of the story, right? Where
I read the story in a different fairy tale book, and later when I was digging up, I found a different version. Very similar version of it in the Andrew Lang collection of fairy tales. And in this version, Booth, the character, was called Cinderlad.
Right. Use the masculine version of Cinderella, Cinder girl and Cinderlad.
Cinderlad, yeah.
So I guess what I want to do here is I want to sort of go through the story and talk about, all the sort of mythopoetic archetypes and arcs that really trace. There are many sort of different threads going on, and I'll try to keep them all straight and not take too long. But basically, one of the things to say here, for those of you who are kind of new to live sacred space, the way we read dreams, myths, and fairy tale in our healing practice, right, is that we regard every major actor in the dream or story as a symbol of a separate part of your own inner self. So the brothers are a part of you, the horses are a part of you, Cinderlad obviously is a part of you, the boots are a part of you, etc., etc. And the way we take insight and emotional nourishment and spiritual nourishment from these stories is that we read them, we see all the figures arranged, all these different symbols of different part of you, and we hit the play button, and then we watch how the action unspools. And then the story itself is kind of this meta archetype that then is a diorama of a different part of the human cycle of life, where it tells you like what's going to happen here, what are the physics there, how do these parts typically interact, who bullies whom, who does what to whom, who redeems everyone, etc., etc. So each one of these fairy tales is like watching this diagram of the life cycle of anything, a shark, an oak tree, where there's like an egg sac mode, an acorn mode, all the way up to full tree mode and then back again. And every single one of these fairy tales zooms in on a different piece of the labyrinthine kind of cycle of life. Not so much to allegorically tell you this is how you should be, but rather to give you nourishment and guidance, to basically say, this is how it happens, this is just the way it is. So that as you're navigating and you find yourself in a dark wooded area that looks like this is the kind of thing you can expect. Right? So these are very old pages of the operating manual of human experience, if you will. So let me make a couple comments here. So the first is boots. Boots are a symbol of protection for the feet. Let me make sure my sound is still, hopefully my sound is still working. Let me just Sorry. Okay, so hopefully the sound is okay now. Sorry about that. Sorry, I keep doing that. I'm going to stop doing that. Okay. So boots are a symbol of protection for your feet. Feet are a symbol of typically two things in dreams. The power of your independence, so the ability to stand on your 2 feet, literally, and the power of your forward mobility on your own power in your path in life. Right? So even if you don't have a car, you don't have a bike, you don't have a horse, you can still walk forward on your own 2 feet. So independence and forward mobility. When you see feet and legs in dreams, that's what it's a symbol of. And boots protect that function and enable it. With boots, you can stand on anything anywhere. You can walk anywhere. You can go forward into places, even off the path, that you couldn't go if you were just barefoot. And these in particular are not just boots. These are ash boots. They continually reference the boots and say, you have ashes on your boots, you look disgusting, etc., etc. So this here is the sort of all-in symbol, these boots. And his name in this version of the story is Boots. In the other story, his name is Cinderella. They are interchangeable. Okay, and because these are ashen boots, this is a story about Cinderella and the power of grief. The Cinderella can do things that nobody else in the kingdom within your own inner kingdom can do. The part of you that has willingly gone into grief, the part of you that willingly sits in the ashes. And so it's boots or Cinderella. So these boots are a symbol of the superpowers you gain after a complete cycle of grief. So in other stories that we've done earlier in this series, we say, so don't be afraid of grief, go down and sit in grief. It will be painful, but it's not necessarily suffering if you know that's what you're doing. And then the pain goes even further and you go back further into suffering. And it's like, okay, but now you know to continue sitting through. Right. So in the Never Wash story, all of those stories, the guidance is to go into grief, don't fear grief, and go all the way through. In this story, it's all already done. He is already Cinderella, he already has his boots, and the number 3 is a symbol of completion. Things happen in threes, ABC, 1, 2, 3, beginning, middle, end, caterpillar, cocoon, butterfly. 3 comes up again and again as a kind of hypnotic archetypal message that this is a story about the physics of completion after grief. Okay. So then what happens after grief and you emerge with all these superpowers? Okay. The first thing to notice is that you are ridiculed just the same. Even after you've gone through, you come up with these magnificent superpowers, you are ridiculed just the same by the older brothers. So, but you have no fear. It rolls right off you. So when you have 3 siblings in these stories, so Cinderella, there are 3 sisters, all these things, they're like sort of siblings of 3. Generally, the third sibling is the frog, is the one who is the lowliest but has the highest power. When we talked about the labyrinth, the third sibling is like the Minotaur, who turns out to be Asterion, the Stella, the star, the highest. And generally, the first 2 siblings are symbols of, those of you who do healing with me, the bully board member, right? The symbols of the inner critic, the inner one who's always threatening you, keeping you in the realm of the profane because it's always fear, threat, and control. Symbols of prestige and some form of wealth. So money and prestige together are basically the currency of the kingdom and realm of fear, threat, and control. So, making decisions in life out of fear, threat, and control, you don't go this way because How are you going to make money doing that? Who's going to love you if you do that? What will the neighbors think? What will your parents think? You'll put the whole family into shame and embarrassment. And fear, threat, and control sets you back on this other path where you put a mask on and go to a job you hate and live a life that you basically can't stand, but you presume keeps you safe. And then in midlife, that safety gets stripped away as well, right? So the markers of that here in this story are that the brothers, the older brothers, are filled with fear. They can't go anywhere, even with their harvest and livelihood on the line. They can't even go and protect the harvest. They just can't go. They make a show of going, but not because they want to protect the harvest. They make a show of going because they fear being shamed and ridiculed. But at the critical moment, they are afraid and they run away and give up. You see this theme all the time, especially in the Northern European tradition, the Grimm's brothers tradition. Prestige is all bluster and no actual power. Prestige is all sniveling, self-pity, complaining, hiding. And so when it's mainly about prestige, it's all about prestige. When in the final moment, it all sort of melts into chicken shit. Prestige in the final critical moment always is chicken shit and runs away. And so this happens for a couple seasons, and then the third season, it's Boots' turn. And the thing about Boots is that he doesn't care either way, right? He's not driven by fear, threat, and control. He's not driven by need or want. He's driven only by desire, where he does stuff for no good reason. When we talk about the 3 levels of will that we've talked about in the past sessions. He goes only when it's his turn. He doesn't try to elbow his way to the front of the line. He doesn't try to run in fear. When it's his turn, in terms of tempo, which we've linked to embodiment in the past, Boots is embodied, right? He goes when it's his time to go. He doesn't try to rush it. He doesn't try to delay it. He has no fear. Basically, he takes things in the moment. And even when he's in the trial in the field of hay, the 3 earthquakes happen. He says, well, after the first earthquake, if it doesn't get worse than this, I mean, I'm still alive. Here I am. Right, so he doesn't future trip and say, well, if it gets worse, I'm toast, I better run now. He says, in the moment, I'm fine, obviously, because I'm not dead. And if it doesn't get worse than this, I'm not going to die, so it's fine. He doesn't guess about the future, so he takes things embodied in the moment. In other words, he remains in the zone of the sacred. He is not subject to fear, threat, and control, and he stays in the present moment. The future, I haven't given this talk on sacred and profane in terms of time, but the future and the past are profane, because the future and the past, number one, are all about fear, threat, and control, right? The things you desire from your past life, from your earlier part of your life, the things you fear, and the things you would like to have in the future based on your past projected forward. All of this is fear, threat, and control. All of this is profane. It's disembodied because your body isn't in the future and the past. It's now. So it's fear, threat, and control. It's disembodied, the present moment is the sacred, right? So he stays in the sacred, in embodiment, in a realm devoid of fear, threat, and control, and he gets through the trial. Where did he get this superpower of no fear? Part of the reason you have no fear in this state, in this part of you, this Boots, frog, kind of never wash, grief-tempered part of you, is not that you're so brave and you're blustery with courage, but because you don't care. One of the reasons you don't care is that after you've sat in the ashes of grief, you're not afraid of anything, because when the worst thing has already happened to you, what else could be worse, right? When there's a loss, on the other hand, and you don't sit with the loss, you run away from the loss. And you're like, oh my gosh, I dodged that bullet, thank goodness. Even though it already happened, you're just dodging the bullet of needing to face it. The loss is still on the books, right? Whatever it is you lost. You're still attitudinally always fearing the next thing. You're still in the profane. You're still driven by the whips of fear, threat, and control. when you do face the loss, it is insanely, profoundly painful. But the cooking fire of that pain is what puts you into pressure and containment. As we said from the very first session, 40 sessions ago, this is our session 40 today. A transformation happens that is really quite difficult to put into words. It's not completely devoid of fear and desire, right? You still act as a normal human. You still want good things. You still want to avoid bad things, as Cinderella, as Boots here is showing. But there is a somewhat different quality about the person who has gone through grief in this way, where it's this attitude of like, yeah, I know I'm going to die. I just sat through all this death of people I love or losses, right? So I know these bad things will happen. It's just a question of when. And so you're not driven by fear anymore, but you're still move forward, right, through desire, right? Need and want are profane. They are the things you will to go after out of fear, threat, and control. But desire, as we've always said in these sessions, is different. It's this third level, right? Again, need, want, and desire, another sort of set of three. Desire are the things you want for no good reason, not whipped by fear, not whipped by lust to like grab something to soothe a wound that you have, but just because you like it for no good reason, right? Grief then seasons and tempers you, right? But that's not why you go into grief. You go into grief because you can't avoid it, right? I mean, nobody would willingly go into that grief. But this kind of grief and surrender is connected to initiation as you go from phase of life to phase of life, right? Grief, in a manner of speaking, is actually the crux of every initiation. Because the point of initiation is to take this earthen vessel of a person and put them through a firing oven, right? And you hope you have created the circumstances in forming the pot and shaping it, selecting the ingredients of the material of the pot, and you put it through the right fire, not too much, not too little, where you hope at the end to get a certain kind of product at the end, right? But you never really know for sure, right? That's the mystery of life. And when we were brainstorming about this idea of the oven and firing and the tempering as a symbol of initiation, another archetype came up that was from the Greek pantheon, who is Hephaestus, right? The metal worker, armorer, blacksmith god. And the signal characteristic of Hephaestus is he makes the most powerful objects. And he is also the one who has gone through arguably the deepest grief of the entire pantheon of the Olympian Greek gods. Right? And that grief he's gone through is what gives him the patience to stay in the furnace, right? His home is the volcano. Hephaestus, his Roman name is Vulcan, right? So Vulcan is the one who lives in the volcano, right? And the volcano itself is like a cooking pot, a furnace, a container of fire and transformation, pressure, and containment, certainly. Hephaestus is the one who made Athena's shield and Achilles' armor. So he makes all these objects that no other god can make. Athena goes to Hephaestus to ask him to make things. The other gods go to Hephaestus to ask him to make objects that they themselves cannot make. And he himself obviously went through tremendous grief. He is a cripple. He has a club foot. Okay. And his mother, I think Hera, was so ashamed that she bore a son with a club foot. She threw him out of Olympus. Initially, he was eventually restored, but his own mother threw him out. And the reason is, we're the gods of Olympus, right? So we're the highest of high. And here, the queen of queen mother, Hera, gives birth to this god who is a cripple. How can a god be a cripple, right? And so there's deep shame in this archetypal figure. And he spent a lot of time sitting in the ash, like Cinderella, like Boots, sitting in the fire, rejected by everyone, down in the deep well, like the frog, right, in the Frog King. And when you sit in the ash long enough, not wriggling, not trying to get away, but you're like, no, you know what? This is home now, and it's actually not that bad. I'm comfortable here. And everyone's like aghast, right? Because when you sit in the fire long enough, in the ash, what you realize is you realize that you can do all things with fire that no one else can do, because they're all too chicken shit. And you start tinkering and doing things with metal for no good reason, right? And so one of the marks, the secret marks of Hephaestus, is that he can imbue objects, shields, armor, sword, suits of armor that are brass and bronze and silver and gold, which are portable and transferable. He can make a set of armor, right, that Achilles' mom can then bring down and give him. And so it's transferable with the gift of divinity. In other words, with the gift of the sacred that no other god can do. No other god can make objects like this. They all have to beg a favor from Hephaestus, because no other god has gone through quite the same level of grief. So it is a superpower, this power of grief, but it is a dubious superpower, at least to the world of the light and the prestigious, Apollonic older brothers. You can make things that help others get honor, and you get none for yourself, and you don't care, right? And that's not why you do it. He is in the ashes. He makes objects that heroes use to do heroic things for no good reason, and that's the nature of Hephaestus. So this chthonic, because Hephaestus, right, is this god of Olympus who lives underground in a volcano. So he is chthonic. He is a denizen of the dark, and he creates divine objects for heroes and gods. Who else do we know comes from the dark and creates objects for heroes and gods and humankind? 2 stories ago, it was the last story, 2 stories ago, it was the story of Raven, right? Raven is born in the darkness. Raven is black. Raven is the one who gets the golden ball, right? So that the eagle can even shine in the sunlight. An eagle does not thank Raven. The minute there's light enough to see Raven, even though he's carrying the light that by which eagle can even see, eagle like runs right at him and tries to take him down. And this is not something to be fixed, right? Eagle is the older brother. The older brother always sort of does that to the Raven younger brother, the sort of dumbling third sibling. This is all within you. So Eagle is within you, Raven is within you. The older brothers are within you, and Cinderella is within you. It is in the archetype intrinsically. It's not something to be fixed. So then Hephaestus is this kind of enabling figure, okay? And he is empowered precisely by the power of grief. And this is exactly the pattern that's shown here in the story. And the big hint here, right, even the title of this fairy tale, now these were all sort of pagan fables before Christianity. But when Christianity took over Northern Europe, they assimilated many of these stories. I mean, Christmas is Christ was not born on December 25th. It's like they moved it into December to be a part of the solstice, right? Which was a pagan sort of tradition. So when Christianity swept through Europe, this tale was then assimilated. And one of the ways they hooked it into the Christian tradition was through St. John's Eve. Okay, which is actually quite lovely and beautiful, because the feast of St. John, is the feast of St. John the Baptist, right? Who is also precisely his own kind of grief figure, and he is a cinder lad, boots-like figure, and also a deeply Hephaestian figure, a kind of enabling figure. And just to go into a bit of a tangent into St. John the Baptist, what do we know about St. John the Baptist? I mean, many of you are either raised in the Christian tradition or familiar with it. St. John the Baptist is the person who baptized and initiated Jesus, right? Which the initiator of the one, the Savior, is its own archetypal kind of role and figure in reality. But the other thing we know about him is that is all the time he spent in the desert. St. John the Baptist himself was a wild man. He was the grief boy sitting in ashes. He lived in the desert, and what does the Bible say? Living off locusts and honey. So these big, oversized grasshoppers, you grab them, you mush them into this protein paste, you mix it with honey, and that's what you eat every day. So, which means when you're wandering the desert, and that is where you live, the desert in Middle Eastern Christian tradition is the furnace of the world, right? It's not the volcano, it's the entire sort of desert where the sun bakes everything. So when you live in the desert and wander in the desert, you are in grief. You live in grief. You live in the ashes. That's the desert version of ashes. Instead of sitting in the fire, you go out into the furnace of the desert itself. And that's just where you live. That's what you call home. You live out there in exile, out in the wilderness. And so another hint here is what happens out in the desert? Well, we know from the tradition of walkabout and sort of other things we know about St. John the Baptist, and even Jesus, the 40 days and 40 nights that the Catholics celebrate as Lent. Out in the desert, you talk to God, you talk to spirits, and they talk to you, right? You're tempted, you go through trials. And then you come back. And like Jesus had obviously superpowers when he came back, but St. John the Baptist, when he comes back out of the desert, he then also has this kind of power of ash and power of grief. And he is the one who initiates the Christ, the Savior of the world. And then the Savior of the world then goes and does his kind of hero's arc kind of thing in the light, right? But all throughout it, there are these hidden sort of deep and loving, very intimate connections between the light and the dark. You can almost say St. John is the raven and Jesus is the eagle. But even after the eagle, the eagle himself goes down into the tomb, right? Jesus is crucified. He's put in the cocoon of the tomb for 3 days and 3 nights, right? Again, cycle of 3. And in the tradition that's not in sort of the sort of regular official Bible, he goes down. Where is he those 3 days and 3 nights? He actually goes down into hell and teaches the dead, right, directly. Because in the full Christian tradition, not just the sanitized, it's unconditional love. He takes care of everyone, right? Even the sinners, even the devil. He goes down into hell and teaches there, comes back up, and then keeps going. And so Boots, then, getting back to the story, is this kind of figure. All the things he does the key things on the eve of St. John's, right? When he goes to the field to sort of deal with the horse. These are all on the eve of St. John's, which is interesting because, the question is, what sort of happens after this, right? So for me, just to stick with the St. John's figure for a bit and to flesh out the rest of this archetype, this St. John's-like figure is archetypally an advisor, an initiator, right? He's the one managing the cooking pot, bringing the pottery piece of you through, right? Making sure you're prepared, right? That you don't go into lunatic where you go into the waters of the eternal and you can't handle it. He makes sure you're prepared, and as you go through, makes sure the fire is not too hot and not too cold, that it's just right. So in this way, he's analogous to many figures. These archetypes are eternal. They come back again and again. So in the Star Wars tradition, right, St. John is Obi-Wan Kenobi. In the Matrix tradition, St. John is Morpheus. And the Arthurian cycle, King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table, Merlin, the wizard Merlin, is the St. John's figure who initiates King Arthur, but also, arranges the conditions for King Arthur to even be born in the first place. So basically, this is a deeply initiatory kind of figure And it's near and dear to my heart because it's a figure that is a part of my kind of role in my bliss work as well. Actually, when I teach the bliss program, I give part of my own stuff as an example. And one of the things I say is that, this is a part of my own mythic pattern, is what we call it in the bliss program. Right? Part of what I do is to advise others and initiate others. And one of the ways I do that when I describe it in the terms of bliss is to say that just like the St. John archetype, now I'm not St. John, but it's a pattern that I follow as a human being, right? As a mere mortal, is that just like in that pattern, I also am not the one, but I am the one who prepares the way for the one, a la St. John and Obi-Wan. And the one that I am preparing the way for is the one within every single one of you. The one within you that is looking for the path of bliss through the thicket and valley of healing to get there so that you can carry the ball into the end zone of your bliss and, live a happy life for yourself. Yeah, sure. But also to rain down blessings on the life of the world around you, because that is what happens when you follow your bliss. There's a bliss path within you that is already there, right? It has chosen you. It has brought you into this world through the golden thread. And part of my job is to be the advisor, the guy, the wild man, out here in exile and pandemic, the grief man, the initiator figure. This kind of archetype is one of two or three parts of, the bliss pattern, the mythic pattern that I have, not created, but discovered in my own golden thread path of my own life. And the characteristic of all these figures, of this archetype itself, of Boots, is that they are no stranger to grief. It's not just the stuff that happened to them or the severity of what's happened. Say, oh, my grief is worse than your grief. It's rather about the insight that they have gained around this power of grief, which they have been willing to go down into for no good reason, right? For no good reason. Where the desert that St. John the Baptist lived in wasn't someplace he was exiled to and then he came back victorious. That was his home. He lives there. He still lives there archetypally, right? And you see the exact same physics in the story where with this Cinderella Boots figure, right? Even after, for crying out loud, even after he's gotten all three of the golden apples, he still goes back home, quote unquote. And where is his home? His home is in the hearth, sitting in the ashes. He's not doing it because it's like, oh, I need to do it and then I'll get through it and then I never have to do that again. It's like, no, that's where he lives because at some level he likes it. He's very comfortable in the ashes. That's why his boots always have ash on them, because he goes there. That's where he sleeps every night. And so another example, those of you who follow Star Wars, Obi-Wan in the first, episode 4, the first Star Wars movie, 1977, he was the one who was in exile watching over Luke, who was like the savior figure of Star Wars, right? Morpheus in The Matrix, piloting his ship in exile. And Merlin definitely was an exile figure as well. So this exile is the thing that gives you the power to do the thing, to prepare the way for the one. And Boots is exactly in this archetype. And the story ends when he's completed this part of the cycle. And then there's a next part of the cycle, if you're lucky, right? This isn't the finish. Like you can imagine that, Boots part 2 would be Boots is the king. And then they have this, child left in front of their door, abandoned, and then they take it in, and that becomes like the Luke, Neo, Christ kind of figure. So back to this power of grief. One of the things you have with this power, and the first thing he uses it for, is to protect the harvest. To protect the harvest. So money and prestige, the older brothers, just ego power. I'm just protecting the harvest or making show of it to protect my prestige and money, to protect my validation from the external world. And that doesn't do it. They don't even see the horse. It's like the earthquake of the horse approaching the harvest, not even to come fight you, but just coming to do its thing every St. John's Eve. And they chicken shit, they run, and they don't even look back. So they don't even get to see the horse. It's pretty pathetic, right? So money and prestige, you're like chicken shit part of you that only cares about external validation, all of these things. Forget it. Forget it. Never going to do it. Only the part of you covered in ashes comes out and is able to stand his ground and protect the harvest of your life and your bliss. How does he do that? The way he tames the horse is he takes the steel out from his tinderbox, throws it over the horse, and magically gains control and cooperation of the horse. The horse, as we've said before, is a symbol of embodiment. So your neck down, the horse is a symbol of the power. So the horse is you too, an equal part of you, or even a superior part of you. Your body is a part of you, or is you. And the horse is a symbol of your body. And when you ride the horse in cooperation, it's a symbol of embodiment. Okay. So this horse part of you is not tameable, right, by the powers of chicken shit, money, and prestige within you. It is only tameable by the power, by the part of you that has gone into grief and lives there. And the steel from the tinderbox is obviously the steel that he uses every night to continue lighting the fires of the hearth, which then produce even more ash for him to sit on. So this tinderbox, right, is a signal marker of the cinder power, the ash grief power, right? And it's a secret signal here, because the idea of why he's covered in cinder and ash is not that, oh, he was caught in a house fire because he was just like, screwing around. He's covered in cinder because of the fires that he lights every night, right? Those of you who have done the Mythic Healing series, the continuing healing series with me in the past, will know the story of the devil's sooty brother, right? This sooty brother, the protagonist, the cinder lad, basically equivalent. Just like Neverwash, his job in the sooty brother story is to keep the fires lit and to clean out the ash, which makes him covered in ash as well. So this firepower of being able to keep yourself in cooking without fear is the power he uses to come into reconciliation with the power of the body. Said another way, grief and the willing, open-eyed acceptance of grief leads to embodiment. Grief leads to embodiment. And we've said this before about bliss and embodiment. So if you had, for instance, body image issues before, where you basically took the horse of your body and said, I don't care, this is you talking to your body, I don't care that you make my life possible. I don't care that you enable me to experience joy, pleasure, right? The wind on my cheek, right? The warm sun on my face. I don't care that you allow me to experience pleasure, the pleasure of a glass of wine, the pleasure of a good meal, the pleasure of hearing a good story, the pleasure of sex. I don't care about any of that. And that you allow me as a vehicle to find and follow my bliss in this lifetime and follow the golden thread. I don't care about any of that. I'm going to take all that for granted, and I'm going to whip you and curse you and starve you until you also look thin and hot and sexy, so that I can continue to satisfy the older brothers of prestige and money and gain all this scripted validation from the external world, right? That's how you talk to your horse when you have body image issues. And when you go through a full cycle or 2 or 3 of grief, you come out of it and you don't care about that anymore, right? You have come into reconciliation with your horse. Again, that's not why you do it. No one would go into grief just to heal body image issues, but as a byproduct, because everything aligns after you come out of grief. You don't care anymore, right? That's not why you do it, but you don't care anymore. And what always happens, right? Once you don't care what you look like, you put the whip down, and the body is like, oh, okay, well, now I'm just going to eat whatever I want. And you're like, okay, here we go. We're going to eat like cookies and ice cream all day long. But what you find is that you don't do that anymore, typically, because you're not soothing the wounds that you're whipping them with, right? So you eat whatever you want to eat, which ends up being reasonable and not harmful, not soothing, not over-grasping. and your body image ends up, just fine. Maybe you're not a candidate for the swimsuit cover the swimsuit issue anymore, but again, you don't care, right? Even when you have all the golden apples, the king has to call you forward, and we'll get to that. So you stop worrying about it, and when you stop under eating or overeating, you let go of the reins, and your horse knows what to do, and your body image ends up being just fine. But either way, you don't care, right? You don't care. So you come to a kind of resolution and reconciliation with your body as well, right? Your validation, said another way, comes from yourself. So each of these then can be seen as a cycle of grief. When you go into the tumbler 1 or 2 or 3 times. So there are 3 jaunts up the glass hill. There are 3 seasons where he needs to go and sort of protect the harvest. There are 3 horses. There are 3 sort of suits of mail, et cetera, et cetera. And I wouldn't take these literally as like, oh, there are 3 big losses I'm going to have in life and then I'm done. It's symbolic. It's like you're going to have these losses until the cycle is complete. However it needs to complete, it will complete. And when you are complete, I mean, there are many different signs we use to sort of tell when grief is complete, and I've mentioned some of them. But one of them in this story is that you're not afraid of grief anymore. You sit in the ashes every night. You light the fires for no reason. It's not because I want to continue being like a good person and, get even higher spiritual development. It's like, no, I light the ashes. I light the fires every night because I light the fires. And this is where I sleep. You finish the cycle. And then as you go through, there's this alchemical refinement that happens when you go from brass to silver to gold. Right? So brass, typically brass or copper or bronze, it's like the red metal, right? Even in the Olympics, it's bronze, silver, gold. It's the same cycle over and over. Bronze is the first level where it's more a symbol of fire. So copper is the metal associated with Mars, with Aries, the war god, the fire god. Silver at the next level is typically more feminine, sort of lunar power. And then gold is the final one, the sort of solar power, the highest level, not in terms of money or riches. When you see money in a dream, it's a symbol of ego power and money. But gold itself is a symbol of insight. It's the golden ball from the Frog King. It's a symbol of the highest level of insight. The whole goal of alchemy, right? The medieval sort of metaphor, allegory, the symbol, the archetype of alchemy was to transform lead into gold, to turn you, within you, from lead through copper, silver, all the way up to gold, where you have been refined. And the way you do that is, in the what's the name of it? There are all these fancy Latin names for it. The vase, VAS, the sort of glass container where you are undergoing pressure and containment, right? You put it in the glass container. It's mercury hermetically sealed, and then fire is applied, and pressure and containment happens, and that's how the transformation happens. Money, ego power, by the way, is archetypally derived from gold, not because gold is, why is gold the most valuable, the most precious? Right? Economists, financiers will talk about the fact that there's no reason why gold should be the most valuable of all metals. That makes no sense. It's not particularly useful. It melts. It's soft at room temperature. So you can't really use it for anything. And they're exactly right. There is no profane utility of gold. It's the sacred archetypal value of gold that makes it so valuable. Right? When the US or countries start to become unstable, the price of gold shoots up. Why is that? Right? What is it about gold where we know that even if the entire economy collapses, if you have gold, it's okay? Even though, titanium, there are all these other sort of modern metals that are more profanely sort of useful. And the reason is that we are still humans. and these archetypes still hold power within us. Not still, they continuously hold power within us. So when we're afraid, when the world of the profane gets unstable, we retreat into the world of the sacred, and one of the highest archetypes of the world of the sacred is gold. The world, put another way, is archetypal. And the only difference is whether you see that or not. And the fact that gold is still so valuable, even though we don't need it for anything important or practical, is one of the countless examples of how the world is actually archetypal. So anyway, he goes through this triple power of the embodiment, through the 3 horses, through the 3 progressive levels of insight: brass, silver, and gold. He gets all the horses, and then we get to the princess on the glass hill. Now, the princess is the inner feminine, unattainable, the seat of vision, the seat of nurturing. Everyone wants this inner feminine ideal. And it is unattainable, not because she's scary, but because there's a level of things you need to get to in order to even commune with and connect with this inner feminine, the muse, the highest vision. And the first thing you need to attain is embodiment. You need a horse. You need embodiment. Okay. Glass is a kind of ice that's permanently frozen. And we know from other things we've talked about that water, right, liquid, is a kind of symbol of insight, right? So it's basically this refinement of brass to silver to gold will allow you to navigate the glass ice ocean of insight to attain this higher sort of vision. Glass, by the way, is actually liquid. Right? When you see how 1,000-year-old stained glass window at like Chartres Cathedral, about an hour outside Paris, Notre Dame, right? A tour guide through Chartres or Notre Dame will say, look at these stained glass windows. They're like, 800 years old. And you can see, even though they're solid, they're not broken, you can see that there's kind of this drippy kind of pattern in the glass. And the reason for that is like glass is still, it seems like a solid, but it's actually, glass is just a very viscous, slow-moving liquid. So over 800 years, you can see the viscous liquid of the glass starting to drip down, right? So this liquid glass is a symbol of insight, which is very smooth. It's very hard to navigate. So the highest vision of the muse and inner feminine requires not sharp intellect, but embodiment, triple horses, and insight. So to get all the way up to the top, you need to have the golden level of embodiment. And of course, in the end, the only way to get all 3 is to go into grief, and to go into grief all the way. And again, this is not something you can do in an intellectually premeditated manner. When you think about the level of grief and how it translates into your actual life, loved ones you may have lost, things you care about, losing things you care about, losing relationships that you care about, losing business ventures, flights of ambition that come crashing down. And you think about losing all these things and then willingly grieving. In other words, sitting with the visceral, insane amount of pain that comes from losing these things. No one in their right mind would willingly want that deal, right? No one would willingly want to go through all that pain, especially all in one lifetime, right? I mean, as we've said before, I mean, for me, I'll just speak for myself, and I'm like the healing expert here, I suppose, right? Of all the grief and loss that I've gone through in my life, and I have been sort of lucky in many ways, but if you had asked me before, it's like, okay, we're going to put you through this, and on the other end, you'll get like these sort of gold superpower, or not even gold, whatever it is level I'm at. I would be like, no, that's okay. Let this cup pass before me, right? As like Jesus would say in the garden. Even the Christ, it's like, is there any way to short circuit this? And it's like, no, it's like, okay, fine. If I guess if we have to do it, we have to do it. But if there were a way we could bargain ourselves out of it, we would. But there isn't. Right? And here, this Cinderella figure, this Boots figure, is extraordinary because this is the person, this part of you that is covered in ash, a fresh coat every morning from having slept in the ashes. And it's mentioned again and again throughout the story. Even his boots are ash, right? And even though he's exhibiting all these superpowers, what do the older brothers of money, prestige, chicken shit fear say, the profane say again and again? You're disgusting. You're like a beast. Why would we want to be seen with you? Why would you ever want to show your grief to anyone in the outside world? You would lose all your validity, validation, all your prestige in a heartbeat. He is the one who has sat in the ashes long enough to do this. And he is the only part of you that can gain this level of insight. Again, not to sort of hit this over and over, but this is the story, right? It's the number 3 over and over again. And these symbols come up over and over again to make sure you get it, even though you're like, these Nordic sort of Vikings sitting around drinking ale at the end of the banquet, like falling asleep. While the bard, the singer is, the troubadour is like telling the story. So finally we come to the golden apples. Now, these golden apples are the ultimate symbol. It's not just your gold mail and armor. It's the golden apples themselves. And again, there are 3 golden apples, once again, 3. Apples are a symbol of wisdom in multiple traditions. In the Arthurian, sort of Celtic, Middle Christian tradition, King Arthur dies or is like wounded, and he's brought to the fairyland of Avalon, where he lives on forever, and it's like this sort of fields of Elysium kind of heaven, paradise kind of place. Ava is apple, right? So Avalon, the V is P. And so to say it in sort of full English, if you were to transliterate it, it's the Isle of Apples. You would call it Apollon. This land of wisdom, this land of sort of eternal sort of life. In the Greek tradition, golden apples are also a symbol of wisdom. The entire Trojan War was started by a golden apple, which was thrown into the wedding of Achilles' parents, and claimed by Hera, Athena, and Aphrodite, because it said, to the fairest, and they all 3 claimed it. And then that led to the judgment of Paris and the whole Trojan War. The apple in the Garden of Eden is a case of the golden apple of wisdom that is withheld from the jealous kind of, I won't go far as to say profane, but there's a lot of fear, threat, and control in the Old Testament. Let's just say that. And he withholds it, you break the rule, and then you're punished. And of course, it's associated with the feminine because it's a patriarchy. So everything bad is associated with the feminine. The snake, which is this deep feminine divine power, is part of like the whole gang that is given detention at the end of the Garden of Eden story. So here we have these, not 1, not 2, but count them 3 golden apples. This triple golden wisdom insight. When you have a body, embodiment, and insight, and you have gone through this purification process yourself. So it is the golden knight riding up all the way. 1/3, 2/3, 3/3, all the way up to the top. And note that you do this in order. Someone I think earlier said, well, why doesn't he just take the golden horse and go all the way to the top? It's because he goes through in the proper order, in the seasons. He's in no rush, right? Even at the end of the story, he has all 3 apples. He can go up and show up and say, here's my claim ticket. I want the princess. He doesn't do that. The king has to go find him, even though he's like won the whole thing. He doesn't demand apples from the princess willingly throws them to him. He doesn't even catch them. They fall into his shoe, his cinder boots. She throws them, she bestows them on him. Because when you do these things the right way within you, there is no negotiation. Right? These things just happen all of a piece like a ginormous clockworks, right? Because the horse is you, the knight is you, the apple is you, and the goddess princess is you. And when all of these elements within you are in accord, these things happen automatically. You don't have to think about doing them. They happen on their own. Right? Over time, one thing leads naturally into another. It's like there's this image in the Upanishads, Hindu scripture, where they say it's like when you have a flint, a sort of fire starter stone, like the steel from the tinderbox, and the flint hits the rock, and the moment it hits the rock, the spark comes out, right? And you know there is a sequence, you know, the flint hits the rock and then the spark comes out, but it happens so quickly, it's as if it's instantaneous, right? So when all of these things are in accord, it all happens instantaneously. You're like, oh, there was this period of my life where I came out of grief and I was like, I don't care what happens anymore. And then all this stuff started happening around me. Like I lost all this weight and all these job offers came in, and I sorted some of them to be like more prestige-y, and I went in this other direction. And then this whole other tidal wave of like good stuff happened. And everybody around me is like, what are you doing? What are you eating? What pills are you taking? I want those pills. And you're like, I don't even know. All this stuff is just happening. Right? So it's this feeling of not brute forcing. Just like the Odyssean, it's not using your oar to brute force. It's just doing this version of winnowing fan, and then the wind is removing the chaff from the wheat. And so the final part here is to get these apples. He basically does all this almost as a reflex, right? At the end of getting the third apple, he goes back into hiding again. He's like, no, it's not like, haha, fools, now give me the princess. He leaves. There is no brute forcing. He's comfortable going back into the hole, into never wash land. He does not seek out prestige. He goes after the apples because it's just for no good reason, out of desire. And he goes back and he sleeps in the ashes again because that's where he lives. After John the Baptist, right, baptizes Jesus, he goes back into the desert because that's his home. That's where he lives. That's where he grew up. That's where he was trained and got all of his downloads and visions. So why would you want to leave that, right? So it's sort of like when you have all these things happening, and at some point you have to ask yourself, or someone presses you and asks you, well, what is your secret? What is your insight? What do you have to say? And you're like, well, I mean, I don't even know. I guess if I had to think about it, I would say this, this, and this. And everyone's blown away, right? And like, oh, you know, this is great. You should write a book. You should do all this stuff. And you're like, oh, yeah, you know, maybe. And then you don't do it. It just happens when it happens. You're not too worried about, right? And you're like, you know, just like the earthquakes, one after another in the beginning of the story. Look, things have flowed this well or poorly or whatever. I'm still alive. It's fine. And if it doesn't get any worse, I'll be fine. You know, why not wait, right? Why not wait? It's almost this kind of Taoistic kind of, where it's not just that you are this lone, lonely ego force in the world, right? Man versus nature, fighting against a dumb, inert nature, whipping a dumb horse, right? Or even worse, a hostile nature. So we have to conquer nature. Instead of all that, you're like, I am a part of nature, right? I'm a part of nature, and you kind of trust yourself. You trust your body. You trust yourself connected through your body to the world around you. And you kind of just trust that everything works out, even if it may not make sense to your intellect at any given time or ever, right? This feeling of like, you can trust life, right? And it's okay to let go and let life, let your body, let these things take care of it. Now, there's a very subtle art to doing this, right? Sometimes we'll say, well, you know, I trusted my body for a week and this happened, so that's it, forget it. Well, that wasn't really trust, because you kind of hid in the closet watching it, ready with a baseball bat, ready to come out and hit it. If it went out of the line, that's not trusting, right? The full trusting is trusting all the way through, all the way to the third horse, all the way up 3/3 of the hill, all the way to the third apple. You don't punch out just because you've had enough of whatever, prestige or whatnot, right? So anyway, at the end of it, he gets the apples, he gets the princess, and basically that's the story. But now he is this kind of extraordinary figure. He is this kind of ash king, right? This grief king. He is the king now. He's not the youngest brother. So you've gotten to this extraordinary power where this grief power is now the king that's running your life, right? Where you have become very John the Baptist, like where you live in the desert and you're happy with it. It's like that John Lennon song where it's like watching the wheels go round and round. And it's everyone says I'm crazy, I'm like gotten out of the big game and you're off the ball. And he's like, I'm just sitting here watching the wheels go round and round, and I really love to watch them roll. And I just have to let it all go, right? So what will you do then in a life like this? Right? You may be like, okay, I go through all this, I get to this grief king part of it. And what do you do next then? What do you do next? Right? Because if you say, I think this is kind of the pattern of my life, but then what's going to come next after this? Well, one of the blessings and superpowers of leaning on the power of archetype to guide you, right? In other words, to have this kind of mythopoetic lens on life, where you look for the mythopoetic pattern, is that if you have a question as to what's coming around the bend, you can just look at the archetype, right? To see what the next part of the pattern is going to be. Okay, so here now, Boots is a grief king. He has been out of the desert eating honey and locusts, and he has been in exile on the desert planet Tatooine in Star Wars. Right, Obi-Wan, when he was young, he was this dashing, swashbuckling Ewan McGregor kind of hot sort of Jedi dude, right? But then in the first Star Wars, he's basically this Alec Guinness old man living in the desert for something like 19 years, right? He is the John the Baptist desert wild man, watching Luke grow up from a distance and watching over him. Okay, that's what this Ash King does. So when you look at the archetype, you realize, oh, Obi-Wan is there for a reason. And the reason is that he has been preparing the way for the one that then comes forth. And he is the one that nurtures and protects and raises and trains and initiates this next emerging aspect of yourself. Right? So Obi-Wan is you, Luke is you too. Right? You have a John the Baptist within you that goes through his cycle, which this Boot story tells. But then after that cycle, we can look at other stories to see what happens after. And what happens after is this John the Baptist figure is created within you. Right? And then he is the one that nurtures the spontaneously emerging Christ within you. Right? It's really touching to me that we have a story like this that's brought from Gowrie's intuition, and through this sort of very, like this whole sort of the last 4 months of live sacred space has literally been us just letting go of the reins of the horse and letting it lead us wherever it will. Because it's sacred space, so we just trust it. Right? Every week we have no idea what we're going to say until Monday or Tuesday when she pulls a random story, random from her intuition, and we read it and we see what happens. So it's so interesting to me that we have a story like this right around the winter solstice and Christmas time, because the Christian Savior is about to be born. He was not actually born on December 25th, but it's kind of sort of blending of the pagan solstice tradition. And so the symbolic Christ, this baby Jesus, is a symbol of the emerging inner masculine, in this case, within you. This is a baby within you. This is the new growth within you, right? This is the one you have been preparing the way for. This one that will then, if you follow the archetype even further, that will then redeem you and bring you back into alignment with everything. In other words, back into the flow of your golden thread, of Tzuran, of bliss. So here you have a John the Baptist within you, the grief king at the end of this Boot story. And now the next step is he waits. And by the way, he's good at that. Right? He sleeps in the ashes. He waited for the king, and now he's going to wait for this sort of orphan child, sort of born in a manger, and he will nurture him through and initiate him as well. Right? So all of these archetypes flow into one another, and they are cyclical. Right? So we will have multiple cycles of this given over the course of a human biological lifespans. We will have multiple John the Baptist phases within us. We will have multiple births of the inner savior within us, just like we have multiple seasons, just like, we experience more than just one Christmas, hopefully, right, in our lifetimes, right? So these arcs are cyclical, not linear beginning to end, but it's a cycle. So this miracle child within you will be protected by the one who has eyes to see and the one who has ears to hear. The only one that would be this Hephaestus king who has gone through grief. And so the question of like what happens after grief, we get drawn out to basically run the kingdom of our own inner life. And this is in preparation for the next cycle of the emerging inner you. So that's it. That's what I think of the story. And I love it. And I love that Gary picked the story for our winter solstice. Gary, are you there? Do you want to come up and share any additional thoughts? Hi.
Hi. Yeah, that was just, it's so jam-packed with insights of the story that I just love that. For a story that just goes with repetition and just going on and on about the same thing, it's just so much packed into it. It's just wonderful.
One of the things I love is that these stories, like, they're sitting right in front of our noses, even in the modern world. It's like, oh, it's Cinderella. It's like the male version of Cinderella. Big deal. It's like that Disney movie. What the hell? Big deal.
Yeah.
But then we connect it to all these things, into the Bible, into like Star Wars and the Matrix. And you realize like the mythopoetic world is all around you, like in the now. Yeah.
And the thing that fascinated me while I was kind of retelling the story today is the amazing thing that when the trial is going on and, the Boots comes in on day 1 and day 2 and day 3, it almost appears as though he isn't particularly there for the princess or the golden apples. He's simply there because there is a trial and because there is a glass hill and because everyone's just doing this thing. So let's go and do this.
It's for no good reason.
It's fascinating because the story actually says that the first day when he was wearing brass mail, he could have gone all the way up if he wanted, but it seemed like he didn't. So it's just whatever he thought that day. So I'm only going to do this today, and that's okay. And he gets the golden apple nevertheless, right? And that part is really touching to me because, the muse was sitting on top, waiting for somebody to make it to the top. And she looks at this knight who's come like 1/3 of the way. And she's sitting there and wishing, oh, how I wish he would make it all the way to the top. And if he doesn't, it still doesn't matter. I like you anyway. Just this far. So I'm going to throw a golden apple at you. And the next day, the same thing happens. And you didn't come all the way, but I like you anyway. And she throws a second golden apple. And then the third one, he takes it from her before she even realizes what's going on. But just the idea that, the muse is just waiting for you to kind of come on this path and come and meet with her where she is just, I don't know, somehow so reassuring.
I mean, one of the things we said about embodiment is that, like the non-fancy, non-intellectual thing to do when you want to be more embodied is to slow down. Is to sort of, moderate and throttle your tempo. And here it's like somebody mentioned it, and it's my first instinct too. It's like, I already have the golden mail. Why don't I just go up and get it and we'll be done with it? Fast, fast, fast. Let's go. Let's move, right? And the characteristic of it, he doesn't even think about it. There's no decision making. It's this steady, firm drumbeat of 3, 3, 3, 3, 3. Beginning, middle, end, ABC, 1, 2, 3. caterpillar, cocoon, butterfly. And here, even with all the powers arrayed around me and the princess right there, we still do 3 because that's how we do it. That's how we do it. It's ready when it's ready, and not before it's ready.
And the other thing that fascinated me was, and I think someone else mentioned this in a question as well, is how when he gets the horses, he isn't immediately thinking about, oh, how do I put this to use? What's the utility value of this? He's not thinking about, harnessing them and using them for something profane where he can get something out of it. And he doesn't even want to show it off to the world and say, hey, I've got these 3 fine divine horses, and they're all mine. It's none of that. I mean, he puts them away and doesn't get them out until there is the right opportunity to get them out. So there is something in that, I thought, the way he treats the horses when he gets those superpowers.
That makes me want to say something here. Thank you for saying that, which is, I keep saying this thing over and over again where it's like, oh yeah, John the Baptist lives in the desert, he's happy. Well, I don't know if happy is the right word, but that's where he lives. Cinderlad continues to live in the ashes every night. You almost wonder if in the castle now as the Grief King, he still sleeps in the kitchen hearth and not in the royal bed. You wonder about that. It is kind of this open question. And I just want to say that to me, it would be a mistake if you were listening to that and say, oh, well, allegorically, Artie's saying, let's just, eat our broccoli and carrots and the things we don't like, and then we'll be rewarded in the end. So sleep in the ashes, even if you have prestige on tap and ready to go, sleep in the ashes anyway, be humble, be humble. That would be a mistake, not mistake, that would be the allegorical way of reading it. The symbolic way of reading it is, when John the Baptist goes back into the desert and Boots the Cinder Lad goes back to sleep, even after all 3 golden apples in his pocket, goes back to sleep in the ashes. If you're like, okay, if it's not this self-improvement, Puritan, Protestant Puritan, self-purification thing, then what is it? Right? The other reason would be that, he sleeps in the ashes because somehow, it's almost impossible to see this from a profane lens. If he's sleeping in the ashes when he doesn't have to, it must be because he likes it. Or there's a nourishment that comes from sleeping in the ashes that he can't get from anywhere else. And I'll just speak for myself. I say that because I feel that in my own life, where there is a kind of nourishment that comes from sleeping in ashes that you can't get anywhere else. And I don't know how else to say. I certainly don't have the words to describe what that nourishment is. But it's not because it's like this Protestant Puritan future preference, or suffer now for your glory in heaven. It's no, it's you don't need to do any of that. You do whatever you want to do. You let the reins of your horse go and let your body lead you however you want. And his horse, fully embodied, leads him to sleep in the ashes. So all I'm saying is there must be a reason. There must be a reason. It's not about future, the profane, and not about the past. I have to pay my penance, or I'm paying for a future heavenly sort of reward. In the now, in your body, there is a reason you continue to sit in grief for no good reason, even though you're done. Here's your certification, passport stamp. You can leave the grief realm anytime you want. You've done your time. I've paid my dues. I've done 30 years of therapy. Everything, isn't this enough? Isn't this enough? Right? There's that next level where you're like, yeah, I'm not worried about that anymore. You can leave the door open on your way out and come and go as you please. Right? And you see this repeated theme in story after story, where you leave the grief realm and then you go back, not to pay your dues again, but because that's just, you left your keys there, you left your glasses there. That's where you live. It's a part of you now, and you claim it as such. That kind of feeling.
It's amazing. So what are the thoughts we can ponder about this week?
The exercise. Okay, let's do the exercise. Yeah. Oh yeah, we got 5 minutes. Okay, so the exercise we thought of here was just and the way you would do this exercise is you would find 5 or 10 minutes sometime this week, sit alone with pen and paper. And you can sit at home. If your home is kind of like a zoo right now, when you drive out to buy groceries and you park the car, you can sit before you get out of the car for an extra 5 or 10 minutes in silence and just do this exercise. And again, this is sacred space, so there is no expectation of participation. There will be no quiz at the end. It's only if you want, only if you want. And the exercise for this week would be to ask, given all this stuff from the story, where are you in your grief cycle? Are you angry? Are you running away? As most of us will be in the profane world at any time, right? Are you like, oh, this is outrageous? How much longer do I have to grieve? How much longer do I have to put up with this BS, right? Are we done yet? Are we done? Can we go? Or if you have decided to go into grief, what level of grieving are you in? Right? Are you at the brass, silver, or gold level? But even less linearly than that. This whole story is a curly-Q circumambulation. It's circle within circle within circle. So sometimes I feel like I'm not even at the silver or gold. I'm not even at the brass. I'm at the second horse of the second earthquake of the second St. John's Eve, way in the beginning of the story. Or I haven't even started the story yet. I'm I don't want to read that story yet. I don't even want to turn the page. Okay. And so given where you are now that you see where you are you willingly going to move forward, or are you still going to resist it? And either is okay. Right? Resisting grief and the forward path is part of the path. Okay. So the exercise is just using this shape of the story to try to locate where you are in the cycle. And then once you locate where you are, you can say to yourself, am I okay with that where I am? And if you're okay with it, carry on, no action needed. Or are you okay, that's where I am, and I've been there for the last 6 months, maybe I want to think about where else what the next step might be that I would maybe consider, right? And you can play around with it. Or if you're no, I move forward and I don't like this, I want to go back, right? Or can I jump this cycle and can I jump into a different epic cycle? And that's valid too. You can try. You can try. And that will be part of the process as well. Okay. So that is the exercise for the week. No pressure. Only if you want. Only if you want. All right. And so with that, that'll be everything we have on deck for the session. And I'll go ahead and close the session. So the next session is next Sunday. Let me just put the link. Our 41st session, I'll put that in the crowdcast, and I'll pop over to Facebook and put this link in Facebook. If you want to sign up there, it's free. And I think the system will auto send you an email when it starts up, and then you can pop in and then stay in crowdcast or go out to the Facebook live side. Please invite others if you want, but no pressure. And thank you so much. So with that, I will hereby close this session of our shared sacred space. Thank you for holding this space with me and with us. And thank you for sharing the nourishment, the emotional nourishment, and the spiritual nourishment of this shared sacred space with us. I give you my blessing. Go in peace, bestowed with blessing, free of fear, free of threat, and the undue control of others. Have a great day, have a great week, and I will see you all in the next session. Thank you. Thank you.